So, welcome everyone to the final episode in our series of 501 Core Colloquium interviews with faculty members. I'm Victoria Broadus, a first-year student, PhD student here at Georgetown, here with Anna von der Goltz, who is an associate professor of German history, who holds a joint appointment in the School of Foreign Service and the History Department. Professor von der Goltz's first monograph was Hindenburg, Power, Myth, and the Rise of the Nazis, and won the Wiener Library's Frankel Prize in Contemporary History. Her current research investigates responses to political, social, and cultural change amongst a plethora of West German conservative groups in the 1960s and 1970s. So, welcome, Professor von der Goltz.
Thank you.
So, our first question is just broadly, what brought you to this topic and your main areas of expertise and interest?
So I came to the topic just after actually finishing work, or while I was finishing work on the dissertation in around, say, 2006 or so, and I was doing applications for postdoctoral work and actually came up with the idea of looking at conservative responses to 1968 in West Germany, because I felt like the history of the left in West Germany 68 had been relatively well researched. I mean, there's obviously still a lot to be done, but I still felt like it was relatively well understood. And I was in Oxford at the time, and I started talking to Robert Gilday, who was a historian of modern France, and he'd been a tutor of mine during my master's project, and he told me that he was just putting together an application for a big externally funded oral history project on Europe in 1968, and he was still looking for somebody to do the two Germanys, actually. And so, we started talking about it, and I mentioned that I was interested in doing oral history as well. He'd done a lot of oral history work before for a previous book on France in the Second World War. And he basically asked me if I wanted to just join in the process of putting together this application to the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which is sort of like the NEH in the US context. And so I, wrote up a sort of short proposal of what I might do, and then we ended up getting the money, and that effectively meant that I put the conservative stuff on hold for quite a while, and actually got some additional funding. I had a postdoc in Oxford, but I got some additional funding to do this project, and it ended up taking quite a few years and significant amounts of time, and really taught me that collaborative work sometimes takes even more time than working individually on something. But that project became Europe 1968, which is the book that you partly looked at for today. And again, I was sort of trying to find an angle that wasn't quite as well researched, and the East German 68 seemed to be the more interesting, and there just seemed to be more room to especially do oral history. And that's how I started thinking about sort of the East German 68. And the article that you read sort of emerged out of this project. I was trying to do something with just the East German interviews, and it became part of a special issue on what oral history might contribute to understanding memories of 68, and so that's that. But I then, after finishing this, returned to my conservative student activist, and that's a monograph I'm currently trying to finish, which also involves a really significant oral history component, but also a lot of archival material, and that's the big difference with the work that you've read, actually. And we can talk more about that later on, I guess.
Great. So you mentioned that you were really interested in the possibilities opened up by looking at East Germany. I wanted to go a little bit further into that. There was a provocative statement in Making Sense of East Germany's 1968 that says the West had 1968 and the East did not. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's behind that statement, and then what lessons we might be able to take from Germany about understanding 1968 globally?
So that statement is actually by Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who was one of the probably best known, I'd say, apart from Rudi Dutschke and someone like Tariq Ali, he was probably Europe's archetypical 68er, one of the most vocal, contributed a lot to codifying the memory of 68. actually, and he said this at a conference in the early 90s, and it was, I think it sort of expresses this idea that the West is somehow the yardstick for what constitutes an actual 68, and I talk about it a little bit in the introduction, that there's really a strong tradition of contrasting the history of East Germany with that of the Federal Republic. And usually when that happens, the East German side comes up short, doesn't have a civic culture, didn't liberalize in the same way, and so forth. And so I was sort of using that to just start talking about what the East German 68 meant. And interestingly, I think some of the earliest voices that started talking about a specific East German 68 were sort of actually arguing against this kind of account. So they were taking statements like Cohn-Bendit's and were sort of trying to write themselves into the story by stressing that actually there was a lot going on in the East, and that it also involved the establishment of a civic culture of dissent from below, sort of grassroots democracy. And so the earliest version, I think, of the Eastern 68 that we get is the one that tries to say it was a lot like the West, and in some ways even better, because we ultimately sparked an actual revolution, not just a sort of cultural liberalization, but we brought about 1989, which is, of course, quite a reductive understanding of 89 as well. As most of you know, Gorbachev actually had something to do with what happened, and just economic reasons and so forth. So clearly 89 is not just about small groups of dissidents, but it's an element of the story, and that's what this one guy sort of talks about. 89 as a direct outcome of 68. I talk about in the introduction to the article. I think that's what he's trying to get at. And so it's really a jumping off point, and the article as a whole, I think, contests that idea that there's nothing worthy of our attention that happened in East Germany on the whole.
On that note, I also wanted to talk about the officially sponsored memory that has come out of 68, or has followed, and because in your essay you discussed the narrative of East German 68 that the government has come to sponsor. So I wanted to see if you could tell us a little bit about that official memory versus what you've come across as collective and individual memory.
So I would say that the official memory of 68 in the GDR, as sort of codified in museums that discuss this history, but also a number of websites dedicated to telling the story of East German oppositional groups, for instance. They focus on the first three set of stories that I discuss in the article. So it's really about 68 as a moment during which people who were either already opposed to the regime or perhaps had actually sort of broadly endorsed socialist institutions, in which they fell out of love with the idea and actually in the aftermath then start opting for more open forms of dissidence. And so Gerd Popper, who's the first person I discuss, he is featured quite often in these discussions. Bernd Eisenfeld as well is quite, not well known, but if you go to those dedicated museums, chances are you will find him as sort of one example of what dissidents looked like around 1968. Not Claudia Wegner, she's actually not that prominent, but her sister Bettina Wegner is extremely well known. She was a very famous singer-songwriter in the GDR and pushed out by the regime, and she was also a very beautiful woman. So, a lot of museums use her as a sort of young, beautiful, revolutionary singer-songwriter who fell out of love with socialism in the end because of the repression she encountered in the wake of 68. And so I would say that those stories are contained most easily within this officially sponsored memory culture. And the reason that in unified Germany it's endorsed is because it's so easy to link it to the post-89 settlement. And those stories, I think, implicitly endorse, as I say in the article, the form of democracy established in unified Germany after 89. The last set of narratives, I think, are much harder to contain because they are about, not so much about the repression that followed the Soviet or Warsaw Pact intervention in Prague, but they're about really the excitement of the Prague Spring as a project of socialist reform from within the Communist Party. They sort of hold on to that belief. And in some instances, actually, someone like Gerd Grosser, who was more of an oppositional figure before, came from quite a bourgeois family. He really becomes an opponent of the regime, an adherent, a supporter of the regime, only in the aftermath of the Prague Spring. And so they just don't quite fit, which doesn't say that just these individuals are out there telling individual stories. They're still a collective in which, I mean, obviously all memory is socially constructed, and both Grosser and Havemann, have sort of spoken about this in some interviews, usually in more left-wing publications. The Party of Democratic Socialism as a sort of vehicle for these kinds of memories. Burkhard Kleinert was a local mayor in Berlin after the wall came down, and he's a member of Die Linke, which is the Party of Democratic Socialism. So there's a context, a group context in which these stories are told and retold as well, but they don't really make it into state-sponsored museums. And I really had to dig much harder to get at these narratives. Kleinert had written about it. But Gerd Grosser, for instance, I sort of came across his name, and I just really it was just much harder to get access to these kinds of stories. And Frank Havemann, as well, was more reluctant to talk, even though he had been on the record about it before. But, it tells you something as well, that they don't really feel that there's necessarily that much room for them to talk about their experiences. So what I try to do in the article is to say that, linking 68 just so unproblematically to 89 and the end of all dreams of socialist reform in the Eastern Bloc is sort of equally reductive, and trying to capture a broader range of voices. And I think this is where the oral history is actually extremely useful to do it.
Yeah. So. Considering how useful oral history is to tell this kind of story, I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more about doing oral history and what challenges you've identified when relying on memories of past events, the narratives that people construct, just your perspectives and how they've even come to evolve maybe through this work on oral history and memory-based research more broadly.
Yeah. So I mean, doing this collaborative project was actually a real challenge because we tried to do 14 countries in Europe with all these different traditions. In a case like West Germany, where there's a lot of material out there, there was also a certain pressure to tell stories that hadn't been told before, but then we were supposed to compare them to cases where there was less of a record. And so it was just, the comparative part was really hard to actually, not do apples and oranges all the time. And originally when the project was conceived, it was meant to be about oral history, but also archival material. And it was also meant to be about experience and events in 68. And the more we worked on it, the less feasible that seemed. And we all also found that just doing the interviews justice and collecting them, transcribing, working with them, and for most of us, it was more of a side project. It wasn't, the next monograph. It was a thing we were doing. And I was on the job market at the time, so also very conscious of, having to sell it. And I guess the solution that we found and in the end went with was to just make it about the oral history. So it's really the whole book, apart from, I would say 1 or 2 articles that use a bit more archival material. I mean, it's really a book, and that's why it's Voices of Revolt. It's really about memory and making sense of activism. And the chapter that you read, Reflections, is really just about people telling the story afterwards. And my article that you read is just about memory. And I think in those cases, it's relatively unproblematic to use the interview. Because, after all, what you're interested in is how people make sense of their experience with hindsight. So the hindsight part is sort of built into the analysis. I think it gets harder when you're trying to reconstruct actual experiences events, people's motivations, reasons for joining a particular group, reconstruct the sort of world of political ideas. And that's something I'm very much struggling with at the moment in writing this monograph on conservatives. And it's based on, I did 30 interviews with mostly Christian democratic students in West Germany, but then also went to something like 14 archives, and they haven't really been studied. So a lot of the material, most of the material I'm using, the written stuff, is also new. And I actually really need to say what they were up to, what they believed, and reconstruct all of that. But then I also have these interviews, and I struggled for a really long time about how to just do it in narrative form, how to sort of get those different materials into the same chapters. In the beginning, I thought I would keep them entirely separate. It would be the facts and then the memory. But that is very hard to do, because a lot of the time, like say I've got this one case of a pro-Vietnam War event that they stage, which got very heated. The left comes and counter-protests, and it's sort of this great event. And I've got about 4 people who are involved in putting it on, who are all talking about what it was like and what it felt like in the room and being shouted down, and what the South Vietnamese ambassador whom they invited was sort of up to, and all this stuff. And then I've got all this newspaper coverage of the event, and I've got a parliamentary investigation committee that was put on, and the university did an inquiry. So I have a lot of archival sources from the time, and it just felt like putting all the archival material here and then all the other stuff, it would just get repetitive. And for the narrative, it's important, it's all in one place, but it means that I'm constantly struggling with, having to make clear, just through my writing, that I'm aware that the interview is something that's done 40, 50 years later. There's an element of hindsight, of course, and I'm trying to just sort of weave it into the writing and to use terms that make clear, claimed, he remembered it like this and this. But I haven't written, I've got a sort of a very early draft for funding applications, but I haven't gone back and actually written the introduction with all the methodology. And I think that that's going to be, that's going to be hard. Not because I don't believe that what I'm doing is okay and is actually sound, but because I know that, some people have quite a radical view of oral history as just problematic and just don't do it because it's too malleable. I really don't believe it, and through sort of triangulating and sort of looking at sources from the period, I mean, there are very few instances where I found people just making stuff up or completely misrepresenting things. It's more that, they give it a certain spin, they invest it with a certain kind of meaning. Interestingly, the pro-Vietnam War activism is not something conservatives like to remember, because the Vietnam War, is not really seen in the same way, I suppose. And so I sort of make that clear in the narrative, but it's not that they, once asked about it, it's not that they tell me they weren't for the war when they were. It's just that sometimes you have to probe a little bit. So I think it's a challenge. It's more challenging, I think, in my current work than I thought it was in this book, which in the end, we focus so much on the memory aspect, as I did in the article. So I'd love to also, based on here, reading Portelli, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how to combine the two, and how to, write a study which is partly based on oral history, but not just a work of oral history. Yeah.
Great.